Well, hello, I'm Renee Williams,
And I'm Billy Thomas.
and welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know what, Billy, this is something that I'm not sure if we want to celebrate or not.
Renee, I feel like we have great shows every week, and this is a really good show. It is too. It's just kind of the topic. You're not sure if it's a celebratory topic or not, but
Exactly.
it is Invasive Species Awareness Week. So we're going to be talking all about invasive species, whether it be plants or critters that are out there causing some issues. So we've got a number of our team on here with us today. We're going to have Dr. Ellen Crocker, who's going to take the lead for us this morning on the Invasive Species Awareness Week. And then we're going to have Laurie Thomas with one of those trees that has a beautiful sounding name, Renee. It's a great sounding name. You'd think it's awesome, right?
But we need to change that name.
You'll find out soon that this tree that Laurie's going to introduce is not so awesome. It's really a problem that we're dealing with. And then we're going to have Dr. Matt Springer talking about some of the critters out there that, believe it or not, are invasive as well. So we're not really celebrating invasive species, but we are raising the awareness this week.
Exactly. And I think that we try to do that every week. Yeah. So let's get started with invasive species.
Hey, Dr. Crocker.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here. Although, again, it's never good to be talking about invasive species, but once they're on your radar, you can't help but notice them and be aware of them. And hopefully this is a good week to kind of call attention to some of these invasives, and also a week where you can share that information with others.
Yeah, so spread the awareness, yes.
Yeah. So first, we're talking about invasive species. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what invasive species are, because it is the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And when we talk about invasive species, I think a lot of different things come to mind for different people. So for some people, it might just be anything that they don't like, right? It's invasive and I don't like it. But, what do we mean when we're talking about invasive species? The official definition of invasive species has two parts. The first part is that it's not native. So it's from some other part of the world. And that's an important part of that definition, because when organisms have been living together for a long time, they kind of grow together and they become familiar with each other. Now, it's not to say that it's all peace and love in the natural world. We know that that's not true. But many of these species, they play well with each other. They have a long history of growing together. And some of these non-native species might not. They might play less well with others, take over and cause problems. And that causing problems part is the key second part of the official definition of an invasive species. It's that it's something whose introduction does or is likely to cause harm. This could be economic, environmental harm, or harm to human health, as some of our invasive pathogens have shown. But really, if we think about it, it's invasive if it's not native, so it's from somewhere else, it's not supposed to be here, and it's causing problems. Now, most definitions of invasive species also have a component that they aren't just kind of causing any problems, they might be taking over. They might be taking over area that would have been with native species, a diversity of native species. And instead, you've got a bunch of invasives that are, clogging things up and just growing really densely. Invasive, however, does not mean without value. There are some invasives that are beautiful in certain lights. And we're going to talk about one of those today. Laurie Thomas is going to tell you about an invasive plant that initially was planted intentionally. And many of our invasive species were brought here, on purpose. If we think about the two plants that I have in this picture here, this is mimosa tree and autumn olive. Both of those, there's a reason why people brought them to begin with. Mimosa has these really fantastic flowers. Autumn olive grows really rapidly, tolerates poor soil conditions. It was propagated for many years to promote wildlife and prevent erosion. And it also has these berries that are eaten by humans as well as wildlife. But that doesn't mean that they belong there. It doesn't mean they should be there. Just because they have a few good traits doesn't mean those good traits outweigh the negative. In the case of both of these, that's going to be, spreading prolifically and displacing the native species that you want. It would be one thing if you just had one or two autumn olive in a field, but that's not what you get. You get a whole sea of them that take over. At the same time, just because something's native or non-native does not necessarily mean it's invasive and does not necessarily mean it's bad. Just because things are from some other part of the world doesn't mean they're going to take over necessarily. And there are lots of animals and plants that we introduced for good reason. Whether we're talking about our agricultural crops, most of which are not going to be native here, but we really value them. We really depend on them. To ornamental trees in the landscape. Here you've got apples, which are not native to North America. Nonetheless, people really value them and like them because they're delicious. And ginkgo tree, which is not native here either, but does not take over. It's not going to spread in the same way that some of these invasive species do. Similarly, just because something's native does not necessarily mean it's desirable to you personally. It might play an important role in the ecosystem, but that doesn't mean that you want to have poison ivy or necessarily grapevines taking over. Poison ivy, for obvious reasons, I don't want it growing where I walk readily because that's going to cause me some human health issues. But grapevines, they're a native species. They provide value to wildlife. At the same time, it could be reasonable to manage it because it's impacting the tree species that you want to keep. So native does not necessarily mean that it's good, and native doesn't necessarily mean that it won't take over locally. So if you think of native species like river cane or sumac or even spicebush, some of those can grow really densely. Locally, they can form kind of a dense layer in a small patch, but they're not going to do what our invasive species are doing. From the plant perspective, our invasive plants, they're going to form these dense monocultures of just that species. Whereas you might see that in some patches with these native species, but they're unlikely to take over your whole forest, right? They've lived here for a long time with these other communities. They have insects that feed on them. They have herbivores. They have other things that keep their populations in check. Whereas a lot of our invasive species might have left those behind wherever they're from, and they come here, they don't have things that are controlling their growth, and they can take over and cause big problems. Now, the question is, why are these invasive species so successful? What about them makes them so good at invading? And I think a lot of it comes down to that interaction with this new environment. They might have some special characteristic or abilities that let them thrive, and they're missing a lot of those enemies. But in general, when we're talking about invasive species, they do have a few common characteristics. So here's a photo of autumn olive again, and I think it illustrates some of these. So you've got really high reproduction, lots and lots of seeds being produced that in this case are going to be eaten by wildlife, by birds, and rapidly dispersed. So that could also happen if you have animals that are moving long distances, insects that can fly, or things that are accidentally being carried around by us. Now, many of these species, they're also a problem because they're taking over, right? So they can grow fast, they can reproduce rapidly. And if they were restricted to just one or two areas, it wouldn't be a problem. But a lot of them can tolerate a wide range of habitats. They don't just have this one special niche or place that they can live. They can live in a lot of places. Now, because a lot of them grow fast and are early colonizers, they tend to be a biggest problem kind of in that early successional or recently disturbed area. And I think for us, when we're thinking about forests and woodlands, that's an important time because that's when you want to see your native species establishing. You want to see that foundation of future diversity. And if instead you're getting invasive species, that's a problem. So many of these do lack those natural predators and pathogens and parasites that would normally keep them in check if they got too abundant. And some of these can even change their environment to their benefit. So, fundamentally different from some of our native species. So some other important characteristics to consider when we're talking about invasive species. And this is one that I see popping up more and more in our area in the woodlands of central Kentucky, and that's Italian arum. Now, it looks like a house plant that's been displaced, right? And this is, you might see it and think, what a cool plant, I like it. But I'm cautious about it because it seems like it's spreading really rapidly. And while it's too early to definitively call it an invasive in our area, because we don't really know, is it having a major negative impact, it has me concerned. And there's a few different features about invasive species in general that are kind of related to that. So first, there can be a long lag time between when an invasive is introduced and when it becomes a problem. And that makes it hard because hindsight is always 2020. We can know in retrospect that bush honeysuckle was going to become an invasive species and a problem in our woodlands. But when it was first introduced and being used as a landscape ornamental, it wouldn't have been clear. And the same could be true with this species or many other non-native species that are introduced for ornamental value. We don't know until it's too late that it's going to be a problem. And then invasive species don't always behave invasively in all contexts. You might struggle to get some of them to grow in your garden, which is always frustrating because then once they escape, they will grow like crazy and be a kind of a wildfire through your woods of invasive species. They might be fine as long as they're in your garden, but that they don't stay put and they'll move beyond that. And then new invasives are always arriving, like this arum that I've got my eye on. There are always new invasive plants, animals, insects, pathogens that we need to be on the lookout for. So when do invasive species show up in your woods? When should you be on the lookout for them? I think especially after any kind of disturbance, whether this is a harvest or you've got people who are walking around on a trail or a road went in. This is an invasive plant that is popped up. And here you can see it right along this road. This is Japanese chaff flower, taking advantage of that disturbance and also taking advantage of us unintentionally moving it around. So here are its seeds, and you can see those could easily be transported along those pathways because they get stuck in clothing and fur. And even if this were a seed that maybe was small and might get in the mud if you're walking around, those trails are going to be a kind of natural corridor for accidentally moving things. Similarly with a fire, if you've got anything that's disturbing the soil or increasing sunlight, some timber stand improvement or any management that you're doing, that's going to allow those invasive species, if they're already there, they can act really fast and take advantage of some of those resources more rapidly than some of our natives. And kind of relatedly, if you have a disturbance like emerald ash borer that comes in, that's a perfect recipe for more invasive problems in your woodlands because you've got a lot of sunlight. And if those invasive plants were already there to begin with, they're going to be the ones that are profiting from it. So here you've got a stand that had ash trees. And when those trees died and opened up some light, what did you get? You didn't get the native species that you wanted because you already had a little bit of bush honeysuckle in there, and instead it just took off. And you can see everything green in this photo is invasive bush honeysuckle. So really, anytime you have a disturbance, you want to be on the lookout for invasive species. And even if you don't have a disturbance, invasive species can surprise you and they can come in. And I think when we're talking about National Invasive Species Awareness Week, one of the things that I'd encourage everyone listening today to do is to think about the invasive species that are a problem in your area and share that information with others, make them aware of that, because a lot of these are things that, unless you are already aware of it and already thinking about it, it might not occur to you. You might see those that in this case, this microstegium growing along the side of a trail and think, oh, it's just a grass. It's no big deal. Nothing I need to be concerned about. But if you were moving equipment in and out of an area that had it and an area that didn't, it'd be easy to accidentally transport it. And the same is true with a lot of other invasive species. I think people being aware of them is really key, because not only can they maybe stop intentionally introducing them. There's a number of invasives that we intentionally introduced thinking it would be a good idea and it wasn't. And this happens all the time in the home kind of landscape environment with different ornamentals, but also with species in woodlands and natural areas where invasives are introduced theoretically to benefit wildlife, but really kind of having an opposite effect. And that, yes, some wildlife might be benefited, but overall, you're getting a lower diversity, which really doesn't support what you're looking for. So kind of discouraging people from introducing them and spreading them, encouraging people to manage those invasive species, especially early, because the sooner you can find these invasives and stop them, the better. Much harder after something is established than it is when you just have a few little plants. Or in the case of what Dr. Springer is going to talk about, it's a lot easier to manage feral hogs when you don't have a whole bunch versus when they're all over. So next up, I think we're going to watch a short video talking a little bit more about invasive species from National Geographic. And I think they do a great job introducing invasive species and what they're doing.
Rapidly growing, consuming, adapting, they conquer. Jeopardizing local economies, threatening human health, and devastating entire ecosystems.
As whole rows of cherished landmarks are condemned, brought home to town-dwelling citizens are the rigid precautions being taken by the Department of Agriculture to save this tree from extinction.
Invasive species are non-native organisms that cause considerable damage when introduced to a new area. These species compete with native wildlife for resources and thrive at the expense of the local ecosystem. The introduction of invasive species is often associated with human activity. Boats that travel between different bodies of water can carry hitchhikers, such as the zebra mussel. One of the most notorious invasive species in the United States, these rapidly reproducing mussels clog pipes and overtake beaches in the Great Lakes. Some invasive species, however, are introduced intentionally. In the early 20th century, cane toads were brought to Australia as a form of pest control. Today, these poisonous amphibians number in the millions and have caused a decline in native predators on the island. It's not just animals. Bacteria, fungi, and plants can also become invasive. Brought to South Africa in the 19th century, the black wattle is an invasive tree often used for timber and firewood. This beautiful tree and other thirsty invasives are depleting the country's already record-low water supply. Because of their impact on human health, ecosystems, and infrastructure, invasive species cost the global economy over $1 trillion each year. Many measures can be taken to help limit the spread of invasive species, but the most effective method is prevention. By carefully cleaning boats before transferring between different bodies of water, not releasing exotic pets into the wild, and planting gardens with native species, we can help prevent the spread of invasive organisms. Every living thing has evolved to play a specialized role within their ecosystem. In the ultimate balancing act, even one invasive species can drastically tilt the scales. If we stay mindful of our role in the spread of these organisms, we can prevent invasions before it is too late.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that video there. I thought it was a really nice introduction to invasive species overall, and something you might like to share with others. And I really liked that it touched on not just the invasive plants, insects, animals that we might see here, but worldwide, this impact that invasive species are having.
Well, thanks, Ellen. We greatly appreciate that. And I want to be honest with you, I think more of invasive species as plants, or trees that, should not be in this area, or bugs, or, something like that. But I really haven't thought about it with animals.
Yeah, and I know we're going to hear more about that. An invasive animal, the problem in our area, but they mentioned zebra mussels. That's another one. And I think it's also worth noting, the big dollar sign impact that these invasive species have. I think that a lot of folks are like, well, we can't really do much about them. Why should we bother with that? And I think the impact that it's having globally is really significant, whether we're talking agriculture, recreation, you name it, those invasive species can be a big problem.
Right.
Well, I mean, again, early detection, right? Let's keep these problems small, so don't get frustrated, folks. If you don't have a lot on your property now, that's great, right? And we want to keep it that way.
Don't wait until you have a lot. Just keep them out.
Yes, no doubt. So being vigilant and, knowing your property, walking your property are great ways to kind of be attuned. And, Ellen, a lot of these things are flowering now or doing their thing when some of our natives are still kind of sleepy. So, find them, get rid of them.
Yeah, definitely. Whether they're plants or animals, it's great to be on the lookout for them. And something I know that Renee always likes to hear, and you might take heart in, is that we're not the only place that gets invasive species, right? Even some of our native species can be a problem elsewhere. So we might love black cherry here, it might play an important role, but when it's not where it belongs in another part of the world, it can cause problems. And I think that just goes to the fact that it's not like these are just fundamentally bad species or they're completely devoid of value. It's just that when they're out of place and they don't fit with the system that they're in, the plants, the animals that are there, they can cause problems.
Thank you, Ellen. I wasn't going to mention that this time, but I was thinking it. So
yeah, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, Dr. Crocker, really appreciate all you're doing from a forest health standpoint here in Kentucky. So thank you for your efforts. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. So keeping on with our invasive theme, we have an invasive tree.
We do. And, Laurie, you normally do kind of trees we'll find here natively in Kentucky, but.
Right. Yeah. And I wouldn't think of this one as a tree of the week because I think that's highlighting one of our native trees. This is called Tree of Heaven. Many of you all have heard it. You've probably seen it. It's pretty common, especially you'll find it in the weirdest places in urban areas. It'll grow out of one of your is like a seam in the sidewalk. Okay, these trees are pretty aggressive and really hardy. So yeah, I wouldn't think of it as a tree of the week. It's an invasive tree. Wanted to highlight this one. And I don't go into much information on control methods because I feel Dr. Crocker handle that. I know we're going to discuss that afterwards, but I do send people to a couple of different sources where you can find some good sound control methods if you do find this tree on your property or in your yard and you want to get rid of it, which you should. So I know.
Take a listen.
All right, so this is Tree of Heaven.
All right. Thank you, Laurie.
I'm Laurie Thomas with the University of Kentucky Forestry and Natural Resources Extension, and I'm here with the invasive tree, Tree of Heaven. Ailanthus altissima is an introduced tree species that is spread across the United States, and it's considered a noxious weed or an invasive species in North America. This deciduous tree is originally from Asia, and it's also known as Chinese sumac and paradise tree. Tree of Heaven was first introduced into the United States in 1784 in Philadelphia as an ornamental tree. After that initial introduction, it was widely planted in urban areas and has spread into a variety of natural areas throughout the United States. It is a fast-growing, short-lived species living about 30 to 70 years. It is a medium to large tree that grows 60 to 70 feet tall, and it can be confused with black walnut, smooth sumac, and Kentucky coffee tree. This fast-growing, hardy tree can establish in the forest and outcompete native trees. It is listed as a severe threat in Kentucky by the Kentucky Exotic Plant Council. Tree of Heaven is native to Asia but is widely naturalized throughout the United States into Canada, and it's found in many counties in Kentucky. It grows best in loamy, moist soils, but tolerates and is successful in a wide range of soils and moisture regimes. In urban areas, it frequently occupies many unique, untended areas, as you can see in the photo. Tree of Heaven is a prolific seeder and very successful at root sprouting. Additionally, the tree's foliage has allelopathic effects on more than 35 different tree species. And allelopathy is the biological phenomenon by which an organism produces one or more chemicals that influences the germination, growth, survival, and reproduction of other organisms. And Tree of Heaven is classified as shade intolerant. Tree of Heaven is a deciduous tree with large, alternately pinnately compound leaves. The leaves can be up to 3 feet long and have 11 to 41 leaflets, and the leaflets tend to have large serrations at the base of the leaflet. Leaflets are green above and green below, and the twigs have an unpleasant odor when they are broken. And fall color is yellowish and not showy. This species is dioecious, meaning a tree will have either male or female flowers, but not both. And the flowers are small, yellow-green in color, and they're usually in 6 to 12-inch long racemes, which look like spikes. Male trees produce 3 to 4 times more flowers than are usually found on female trees. Male flowers have a very disagreeable odor, and the flowers are pollinated by insects, including bees. The fruit is a twisted samara, or a winged seed, that's about 1 to 1.5 inches long, with the seed in the center of the wing. The samaras are in hanging groups and are greenish to reddish brown, and these clusters of fruits can contain hundreds of seeds. The fruit tends to persist on the tree through winter, but seeds can be dispersed any time after October when they start to ripen. The seeds are wind dispersed, and the tree is a prolific seeder with most abundant production between 12 and 20 years. The bark is thin, gray to light brown, and many describe the bark on young trees as resembling the skin of a cantaloupe. The bark tends to develop a rough texture and turn darker gray as it ages. Since Tree of Heaven is considered an invasive tree species, if you find it on your property, you will want to take steps to control or remove the tree or trees. And for more control methods, refer to the Kentucky Woodland Magazine, Volume 2, Issue 1, or refer to the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council Invasive Plant Manual, which you can find both of those online. Now for a few interesting facts about Tree of Heaven. In China, the Tree of Heaven has a long and rich history. It was mentioned in the oldest extant Chinese dictionary and is listed in many Chinese medical texts for its medicinal qualities. It has been grown extensively both in China and abroad as a host plant for the Ailanthus silk moth, which is used in silk production. Ailanthus, or Tree of Heaven, was the tree in the novel A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. The scientific name Ailanthus is from the Indonesia Ailanto, which means tree of heaven, and altissima is from the Latin altus, which means high, in reference to the height of the tree. I hope you get the opportunity to get out into your woodland, local park, or neighborhood and scout for this invasive tree of heaven.
Yeah, several of us were talking about different control techniques, and I know Ellen and Eric were
Eric,
both
get on here as
has
well.
quite a bit of experience. I got to admit, in parks, when I worked in Parks and Recreation, we had this occasionally. It wasn't huge, fortunately for us, but I know there's some other areas that it can be a bigger problem. So, but yeah, they've got some good tips too.
So how do you get rid of this, guys?
Well, what you definitely don't want to do is just cut it and let it sprout back up. Now, the
Make it
exception to
mad,
that,
from my understanding.
it'll sprout back up worse than it was to begin with. Now, the exception to that being if you have a large individual that's producing a lot of seeds, you just want to get rid of that, as fast as possible, because especially if you've got a site with a lot of disturbance, if you just had a harvest and you have a lot of seed that are coming in, I mean, that can be a big problem. But in general, herbicide is a key part of managing tree of heaven and other kind of woody species, because otherwise it's just going to sprout right back up.
And Eric, you've actually had some
we've
this, right?
there's several different techniques that work really well. Basal spraying works well, where it's thin bark, and you're going to apply that chemical, and the carrier, whether it's crop oil, kerosene, diesel fuel, that's the herbicides mixed with, works well. The hack and squirt with the same type of chemical, but using it, creating a wound and treating that wound with the spray. One of the things is kind of a really interesting phenomenon with this is, so I've looked at some kind of quality assurance for cost share practices, and the technical service provider will go in, just because it's easier to do it at chest height or weight on these smaller tree of heaven sprouts, and they'll completely whack them off, and then we'll treat that cut, or where they cut that stem off. And the tree of heaven and some of our native species will do it as well, will sprout below that cut. And I don't have really a good explanation, other than somehow when you completely sever that stem, it creates a response in that tree seedling to put on new growth, and maybe you don't get good herbicide take up. But if you just injure that stem, that real thin stem, where make like a little slice in it, or even just scratch the bark and apply that, you'll get a much better kill than completely severing it. So it's kind of interesting to see. Yes, one of our landowners brought it to, he's done almost 1,000 acres of mid-story removal, and he noticed it that in beech, where he was doing a lot of beech removal, and he was having much better. And then I noticed it in tree of heaven a lot too. So anyhow, it's going to take chemical. Triclopyr, I see the chat, just Garlon 4, and then works well. That's what we typically used on it, because you could put it in with the oil-based carrier. Crossbow would work as well. You got to be a little bit careful with crossbow at the timing, because it has 2,4-D in it, and 2,4-D will volatilize in warmer weather, and you'll kill some non-targets. Anything else?
The only thing I was going to say is that you rarely just find one tree of heaven. Usually you'll find a whole bunch together, and it grows clonally. So they're going to be connected through the root system. So if you use one of the practices that Eric recommended, that will hopefully not only kill that one tree, but also kill the others that are actually just part of that same, body, connected through that root system.
And one of the best ways is, and you mentioned it, if you're going to have a harvest, is to remove the tree of heaven prior to your planned harvest and get rid of that seed source, and that works wonders. And then if you do have some popping in because this is a windblown seed and it can come in from who knows how far, the little bitty saplings that are waist high, you can pull them out of the ground pretty easily, and that's just as good a control as walking through after your harvest, a year afterwards, and just start popping them out of the ground.
And if you're thinking, oh, I've never seen this, it's not a problem for me, I guarantee that if you go find the closest railroad to you
Yeah.
and look along the side of it, you'll probably find it. It takes advantage of disturbance. It can grow really rapidly. And, pretty much anywhere I am, if I find, those rails, I'll see it growing on the sides. And then you'll start to pick it up growing in all sorts of other places. And it can be really problematic, as Eric mentioned, if you've got a harvest and you want to see regeneration of your native species, and what you get is tree of heaven seed coming in and causing problems there. So unfortunately, you're not safe from tree of heaven. It is everywhere.
Sounds like this
And
tree
you'll
needs a
see
new
it.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I told you, Renee. I was like, man.
The other thing I'll throw out there is in its smaller stages is it can be confused with some natives, often confused with sumac,
Mhm.
with walnut. And so as the easiest way to do is just break off a branch or a leaf and it will smell high heaven.
Yep,
If
it stinks.
identification issues, but you can glance. I mean, I've been dealing with it for a gazillion years, and you'll glance over at it. It's like, oh, that's sumac. And then and it's just easy to misidentify when you're wading through stuff. So anyhow, that's telltale characteristic.
Yes, is the bad smell.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh.
What would you relate the smell to? Is there anything to?
I want to say we talked about it like a rancid peanut butter smell is what when we took dendrology. I mean, it's potent. When you
It's
break it, you
pungent.
can smell it.
You
Yeah.
know it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, some good tips there, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a good experience dealing with that booger hemp.
Yeah. All right. So we're still on the invasive species,
But instead of plants,
animals.
yeah. So Dr. Matt Springer was able to put together a presentation for us, and we'll go ahead and get that rolling.
Good morning. So today, with it being Invasive Species Week, we're going to touch on one of our wildlife invasive species that's actually a giant concern across Kentucky as well as most of the United States. And that is wild pigs or feral hogs, wild swine. There's a few names, but it's one that we have a very big concern about in Kentucky. We're kind of on the front lines of their movement north. Where they're somewhat established in certain places here, but it's not like it is down south where they're pretty much fully established, widespread across much of the area. So let's get into a little bit about feral pigs, wild pigs. So wild pigs in general. So wild pigs have actually been in North America and the islands for a very long time. Spanish explorers would actually bring pigs with them on their boats and release them on the islands so that there would be a very strong and continuous food supply for those travelers along the way. Christopher Columbus in his second voyage actually had 8 pigs on the ship that he would not let the crew consume because of the idea that there needs to be some sort of familiar animal anywhere they went. And they let them go on one of the Canary Islands in 1493 and established a population that they knew there would be a food supply there that they're familiar with if they ever needed it. And the pigs, because of their generalist behavior, would thrive wherever they were brought to. Strangely enough, though, that the populations, even though they were there for hundreds of years, were relatively stable and confined until recently. Where things started to pick up, and it's a problem, or things are becoming a problem when they start writing books about dealing with them, which started to happen in the 90s and early into the 2000s, trying to understand and kind of combat wild pigs. And things have kind of progressed further, and this is one of the more recent books on management with a large group of folks that have been very active with dealing with wild pigs for a long time. Well, why do we even care about wild pigs? Well, to be honest, they're in the wildlife world. There's nothing more destructive in terms of invasive species than wild pigs. Annually, it's estimated to be about $1.5 billion in damage and control costs. Now, most of that can be things like crop damage, row crops. They can destroy a 20-acre cornfield in one night. pasture destruction with rooting. There's disease issues, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here later, as well as potential for direct loss of livestock. Wild pigs are very much carnivores. They will consume and kill calves, sheep, goats, almost anything. Their appetite is they're wide in terms of what they are willing to consume and the ability to consume it. They also potentially carry upwards of 30 different diseases and 40 different parasites. So as these animals are moved around, they are bringing these issues with them. I haven't even touched on the issues with ecosystems and the problems they cause in terms of tree issues. And I mean, all that rooting that they do in fields is also happening in forests, grasslands. The wallows that they create, which are basically these puddles, are maintain and consistent damage. They consume native wildlife, game birds, fawns, other nesting birds, destroying habitat, all the above. They're just bad news in general. And as you can see here, there's been a pretty quick progression north, where the areas in blue were their range in 1982. But over the last 25, 30 years, that range has greatly expanded to areas further north up into the New England. We see populations now in North Dakota, up in the UP. So there's been some introductions that have expanded the range of wild pigs significantly. And once they are expanded and take a stronghold, they're very difficult to get rid of. So pigs in Kentucky, a little bit more, we have basically these eradication areas, these priority areas where we have had wild pig populations established in some level, shape, or form. That may be a couple hundred hogs, or it could be a establishing population. So the map in here, the red areas are where we have known pig populations that are fairly significant and well established. So you look at the Lake Cumberland area, Henry County. We have some in eastern Kentucky. The land between the lakes area has some. So we have about 5 or 6 areas, give or take, that are of concern and priority areas for eradication efforts. We want to and have been through cooperative efforts between USDA Wildlife Services, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, and many other partners in Farm Bureau, Kentucky Farm Bureau, NRCS, U.S. Forest Service, have been working to shrink that. And actually, we've been winning. It's one of the things we don't get to say very much in wild pig management. We've been winning against pigs in Kentucky, and we're hoping to continue that. So the big thing here is getting folks on board, because one of the main reasons that pigs have spread is this increase in cultural hunting of hogs, where folks that have gone south to hunt hogs have enjoyed it, and then they want to have pig hunting and be available to where they live, so they don't have to travel as far to do so. So we see a lot of range expansion has happened with folks that are just open in the back of a trailer, where they have hogs that they may have brought up from the south, or the thing that makes wild pigs so successful is that within 2 generations of being out in the wild, they actually revert back to their feral form. They'll regrow their tusks and are completely basically back to wild pig form and reproduce incredibly fast. So a lot of these expansions have actually happened not because the pigs themselves have moved them, but hunters have moved them. So there's a big effort on trying to keep that in check. And the messaging that we use is, why should we care about this? Why don't we, hunting pigs is for folks is a lot of fun. It's a business down south. Well, it's really, all those things that people hunt. There are folks that want to hunt them. Well, they're going to lose all the things that they traditionally would hunt in this area. So quail populations, turkey populations, deer populations, all of that will decrease when there's pigs in the area, in addition to the issues that we have with forests, with crop damage, and so on. So it's very easy to see why all those partners came together, because of the destruction that pigs can cause. So with that said, there's another big concern with the disease aspect, where we're much more closely related to pigs than we want necessarily to admit. And there's many pig diseases that we can easily contract as humans. It's a concern for those who actually are hunting pigs or encounter them in the wild, or there's a very easy understanding that wild pigs interacting with domestic pigs, there's an easy transfer of diseases there, which is a big concern for our producers. But there's also the human transfer, and there's several of these can be contracted by humans, as you can see in the table here. There's a lot of resources out there on how to deal with that if you are, say, hunting wild pigs, but it's something that, as biologists, we deal with if we're trying to control them as well. My counterpart in Tennessee, I believe, had contracted some issues from wild pigs, and I've had several other friends that when they dealt with them in Texas had issues. So it's many of these diseases that they potentially carry are not good news for us personally, as well as domestic producers of hogs do not want to have them around. So it's another level of destruction and issues associated with them. There's never good news when it comes to invasive species, unfortunately. So all of these impacts and potential impacts are concerning. So how do we manage pigs and deal with them effectively in Kentucky? Well, the biggest thing is if you see a pig, you want to alert the right people. So you want to be on the lookout for things like tracks. Okay. Well, pig tracks and deer tracks are very similar. And therefore, it can be hard to tell. But if you do see tracks that, you're suspicious about, you may want to report them. That's fine. But one of the best tools we have and the ways we generally see them show up are on things like trail cameras, and especially around folks that are feeding deer or for hunting purposes or feeding wildlife. They're going to key in on that. And this is a pretty telltale sign. Now, wild pigs generally come in a wide set of colors, but pigs are pigs. And if they're out and showing up on your land, we need to know and deal with them. Usually there's a couple steps that go into that. So if you start noticing signs that you think maybe pigs, or maybe you are seeing pigs, what do you do? Well, first and foremost, we don't want you to shoot them if there's a sounder of pigs. If you see an individual pig, that is a situation where you want to shoot. And the reasoning behind that is that trapping, especially, and organized aerial shooting are the most effective methods we have at controlling populations. And when we're talking about newly establishing populations, it's really important that you trap them all at once. What happens when you shoot into a group of pigs, which is called a sounder, is you may get one or two, but these guys are generally in groups of it might be one or two females and they're piglets. Pigs can have 2 litters a year. Usually averages about 6-ish piglets, upwards of 10. So they can reproduce very quickly. If you shoot into a sounder, you may get 1 or 2 of those pigs, but the rest then get educated about the situation and therefore usually leave the area. They can go 10, 15 miles away. So you have to find them again. And they're going to be very suspicious of whatever situation you have and human scent in general. So it makes it harder to deal with. And by the time you find them, they may have had another litter and now all of a sudden you have even more pigs to deal with. So the best thing you can do is find the pigs, set up a trap and catch the entire sounder at once using what we have now are pretty sophisticated cage traps or door traps and fences where you have complete camera equipment monitoring that trap site 24/7, where the biologists are sitting there looking at their phone at how many pigs are in there, and they count how many pigs they had and make sure they have them all, and they send a text message to the door to close. It's very sophisticated, very efficient. Aerial shooting is the other mechanism. The eastern area of Wildlife Services here runs 5 different helicopter operations separately to go to remove wild pigs. And they work with landowners to get permission to try to shoot on their property where they can follow the sounder until they make sure that every pig in the sounder is eliminated. And then they go collect them. So these are really important. And the only way they can get to these new pig populations is if you report them. So it's the mechanism or the saying that they have is report, don't shoot. And we want to make sure that we follow that. And if you have any suspicion at all about pigs on your property, you want to report it. And that's the great thing that we have in place right now is folks that are dedicated to coming out to each of those reports and investigating them with the landowner to make sure that these pigs are not present on the property. And if they are out there trying to remove them, not the landowner themselves. Down south, the structure is so that the landowner has to do a lot of the work. Here we have mechanisms in place where it is USDA Wildlife Services that's doing it, or Fish and Wildlife that's doing it. To aid the landowner, and they're the ones that are running the traps to make sure it's done as efficiently and effectively as possible. So with that said, if you know of any wild pigs or seen any wild pigs, want to make sure that report it. So you can either give that telephone number there, call 1-800-858-1549. That'll put you in contact with the pig biologist, Terry Brunges, at Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. There's also a wonderful website that they put together, they just updated, that has all kinds of information relative to pigs, diseases, management, what's going on, damage, how to find pigs or identify pigs when they're in the area. If you're interested in finding out more information about any pig diseases, University of Georgia has a great page there that goes through all of them that are known and concerns and so on associated with each disease. And please, we don't want pigs in Kentucky. It's something that if they do get established, the amount of damage is going to be immense, and there's no way of getting around it. Once they're here, it's very difficult to get rid of them. So please report them if you do see them. And if you have any questions relative to wild pigs or concerns about anything on your property with wild pigs, please don't hesitate to reach out to me as well. If you don't want to go directly to Fish and Wildlife, that's fine. And go ahead and shoot me an email or give me a phone call, mattspringer@uky.edu or 859-257-8633. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
We love the fact that we have such a diverse amount of people on our staff that can, talk about different things. And, like I said, when I first thought of invasive species for this week, I was not thinking animals, but, I learned something.
Yeah, unfortunately, Renee, there's too many invasives out there that we've got to keep up with. And, just echo what you said. We are blessed here in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources to have a diverse extension team that can kind of cover a lot of the waterfront out there. So it's good to be a part of this group. But, I'll remind all our viewers, you also got a great network in your communities, right? Our county extension agents are amazing resources spread out in every county here in Kentucky. If you don't know them, get to know them. They're a great resource. If you've seen something on your property you're not sure, they're a great front line of defense, letting them know what's going on, what they may be familiar. If not, they can always reach out to us or others to try to get that information. So we're well connected with them, and I encourage you all to get to know your county agents in your communities.
Definitely. So, another thing is if you have any questions that you just can't get answered, you can send us an email. You go to fromthewoodstoday.com, and all of our videos are posted there, as well as the email link, little survey you can take, and just send us a picture. What is this? I have never seen this before. Maybe you found some of those invasive species Ellen was talking about that she's on the lookout for. It's possible that you might have a new one. Hopefully not, but if you just want questions answered, definitely send us an email and we'll try to get it answered for you.
Yeah, as you're saying that, Renee, maybe our viewers may not be familiar, but not only From the Woods Today do we have, but also just ukforestry.org is a link to our homepage, and there you can really tap into kind of all the resources that we have. Check us out, learn some more, let us know what you're seeing in your neck of the woods. Exactly. So we are done for today, but we appreciate you joining us each and every week, and we will see you next week at 11 o'clock. Take care.
From the woods today.